Today, we are going to share a book called Checklist Manifesto. This book is about 224 pages, and I will spend about 25 minutes sharing the essence of the book with you. How can we avoid making mistakes and continuously do things correctly, safely, and effectively? Before we get started, please click on the subscribe button below the video to stay updated and support Daily Book Dive. The author of this book is Atul Gawande, the youngest health policy advisor at the White House and a medical worker highly praised by Charlie Munger. In 2010, Time magazine listed him as the only doctor on its 100 most influential people in the world. As a doctor, the nature of Gawande's work demands that he meticulously avoids mistakes because the costs of errors in this field are nearly unbearable. Thus, Gawande has always sought ways to reduce errors and increase the accuracy of his work, until he discovered the checklist. Financial mogul Warren Buffett once said that his success in investing is not just due to making the right decisions but also because he manages to avoid making some foolish mistakes. In the author's view, a checklist is a necessary method to get things done correctly. Even the renowned Science magazine openly declared in a book review that everyone should have a checklist. For example, over 4 million people live in the slums of Pakistan, where nearly all the water sources are contaminated, and 10% of children do not live to see their 5th birthday, mainly dying from diarrhea and acute respiratory infections. Managing sewage is not an easy task, but a young man addressed this issue using a checklist, providing locals with a list of 6 situations in which to use soap. 1 year later, the incidence of child illness in the area significantly decreased. Another example is from 1935 when Boeing developed the B-17 bomber, known as the Flying Fortress, which was significantly more complex to operate. Instead of extending training time for pilots, they simply compiled a checklist. After this seemingly simple flight checklist was introduced, the B-17 bombers flew safely for 2.9 million kilometers, were ordered by the U.S. military in quantities exceeding 13,000, and achieved decisive air superiority in World War II. A surgical checklist reduced the rate of surgery infections from 11% to 0%. A construction checklist reduced the annual rate of construction accidents to less than 0.02%. An investment checklist helped a portfolio grow in market value by 160%. Why are checklists so powerful? Next, we will discuss from 3 aspects how to use checklists to reduce errors. First, why do people make mistakes? Second, how checklists prevent the occurrence of errors. Third, what are the 3 main principles for creating an effective checklist? Part 1. Why do people make mistakes? Human errors can be divided into 2 types: errors of ignorance and errors of ineptitude. Errors of ignorance are those made because you do not have the correct knowledge, due to a lack of relevant information. For example, you may not know to consider the possibility of earthquakes when building a house, leading to a poorly placed or improperly constructed house. This is an error of ignorance. Or, if you have never learned about electricity but tamper with home appliances and end up damaging them, this is also an error of ignorance. Another type of error is an error of ineptitude, which occurs when you have the correct knowledge but fail to apply it correctly. For instance, if you are an airline pilot who knows all the pre-flight procedures but forget to unlock the rudder before takeoff, resulting in a crash, that is an error of ineptitude. This type of tragic error actually occurred in the past when a Boeing B-17 bomber crashed during a demonstration for the U.S. military because the pilot forgot to unlock the rudder before takeoff, almost bankrupting Boeing. Not only in incidents like aircraft accidents but in everyday work and life, we commit various errors of ineptitude, such as forgetting the time of a meeting or a lawyer using the wrong legal provision. These errors of ineptitude are entirely avoidable, but they keep occurring. Why? There are 2 reasons, which are also the reasons why checklists are effective. First, people cannot remember everything. The complexity of the modern world has exceeded human capability to control. For example, you just finished a call with a client and another call comes in. Once that call is over, a colleague comes over to discuss a meeting, and you might likely forget the commitment you made to the first client, leading to dissatisfaction. It's not that you can't fulfill the client's task, but that you forgot due to handling too many things. This is a common situation. People often forget things under high pressure. Second, memory and experience can make people complacent, leading to errors of ineptitude. For example, there was a news story in 2009 about an 84-year-old man who broke his right leg and was taken to the hospital for surgery. But the surgery was performed on the left leg, leaving the right leg still broken. Upon investigating the cause of the surgery error, it turned out that the surgical notification had mistakenly listed the right leg as the left leg. Most astonishingly, the chief surgeon, assistant, mechanic, and anesthetist had all failed to check the surgical notification, leading to the wrong leg being operated on, causing the elderly man to suffer twice. This kind of mistake occurs because we rely on what we assume to be our proficient experience and memory, carelessly skipping some basic but crucial steps. You might say, isn't a checklist just writing down what needs to be done on a list? That seems ordinary enough, but how can it help us avoid errors of ineptitude? Actually, a checklist has two valuable aspects: outsourcing and reliability. Outsourcing here means that we delegate the work our brains need to remember to the checklist. Under stress, our brain's memory capacity is actually very unreliable. The magical number 7 concept says that the brain can only remember up to 7 things at once. Beyond that, it can't keep track. Brain science experiments have even demonstrated that the brain might only be able to simultaneously remember 4 memory chunks. Regardless, we know that the brain is prone to errors when juggling multiple and highly tense situations. Using a checklist effectively outsources the memory work to the checklist, allowing the brain to concentrate on judgment, thereby avoiding errors due to the brain's memory limitations. This is the first reason why checklists are effective. The second function of a checklist is reliability. Because human experience and memory are always unstable, our work performance can be affected by our proficiency or even our mental state on a particular day. By using a checklist, we transform the work process from relying on memory and experience to a visualized, mandatory protocol, ensuring that important steps are not missed regardless of the situation. This is the second reason why checklists are effective. Part 2. How can checklists help us solve problems? This is the second topic we need to discuss: how checklists prevent errors of ineptitude. To make checklists work, 2 important steps are needed. First, categorizing the problems we encounter. Second, applying different strategies for different types of problems. Let's start with the first step: categorizing problems. The problems we encounter in the world can generally be divided into 3 types: simple problems, complex problems, and extremely complex problems. Simple problems are those that have clear solutions and steps. For example, making a cake has a clear procedure, and following the recipe will prevent mistakes. The second type, complex problems, such as sending a rocket to the moon or completing a large corporate acquisition and merger, involve strong professionalism, complicated technology, and numerous steps. These are complex problems. The third type is called extremely complex problems, which are very uncertain in outcome, such as raising children to become successful adults. Many factors can influence the outcome, and the uncertainty is very high. Checklists have corresponding solutions for these 3 types of problems. For the first type, simple problems, we use an execution checklist. This method is very straightforward because simple problems have steps, and the fear is that we might forget, so we create an execution checklist to remind ourselves and avoid mistakes. For instance, I used to often forget things before going to work. One day I might forget my keys, another day my wallet. Later, a friend told me to recite phone, wallet, keys, bus card before leaving the house. Checking each as I recited, and I found this method really effective. This pre-departure mnemonic is essentially an execution checklist, simple and effective. For the second situation, dealing with complex problems, we use a verification checklist. Complex problems require many steps and strong professionalism, and it's easy for a person's attention to lapse, causing them to forget many important steps. For such issues, a verification checklist is used at critical points to check whether any important steps have been missed. For example, financial investment is a complex issue that requires considering many factors. Charlie Munger, a partner of Warren Buffett, highly advocates the use of verification checklists in investing, and he even once said in a public speech, "There is no better method than a verification checklist to avoid making mistakes in investing." Not only does Charlie Munger use verification checklists, but many well-known investors also use them. The book provides an example of a financial investor named Cook, who organized the items he needed to pay attention to at various stages of the investment process into a checklist. He has a checklist called the third day checklist, meaning that on the third day of analyzing a company, he would take out this checklist. This checklist has a requirement for researchers to carefully analyze the footnotes of the financial statements, those small print sections, and then carefully read the major management risk statements. These are actually the most basic information provided in financial statements, but people often forget to read them. So Cook relies on the verification checklist to ensure that every important step is not missed, greatly avoiding uncontrollable risks. Cook said that he might check 50 times and find nothing 49 times, but just one successful check can prevent a huge loss. For such complex problems, a verification checklist is used to ensure that those easy-to-miss details and important steps are completely covered, preventing errors of ineptitude in complex situations. For the third situation, dealing with the uncertainty of extremely complex problems, use a verification checklist combined with a communication checklist. That is, in addition to using a verification checklist to ensure that every step of a complex problem is noted, a communication checklist is also used to deal with unexpected issues that arise during the process. A very typical industry is the construction industry. Building a house actually involves many factors to consider, such as geological conditions, the composition of the soil, the strength combination of different materials, the ideal height, etc. Many factors need to be considered, and during the process of building a house, many problems that exceed expectations can occur. If you need to build a skyscraper with hundreds of floors, then these problems become even more complex. In such a complex and highly uncertain field, it's curious that the serious accident rate in the construction industry in the USA is less than 0.02% per year. How do they achieve this? It turns out that the construction industry relies on two sets of checklists to ensure safety. One set is the verification checklist mentioned earlier, where different departments submit task lists, similar to our verification checklist, which are integrated by a specialized team to coordinate the tasks that various teams need to complete. For example, whether their work is proceeding as scheduled, how their materials are arranged, and when the next team will enter the site, all rely on task lists for coordination, solving complex problems. But in this process, many unexpected situations or unforeseen problems may also occur. For example, if the construction sequence is correct, but the floor suddenly caves in, or if the originally specified steel type suddenly runs out, can another type be substituted, etc.? How do you solve problems like these that were not anticipated or suddenly occur? This requires a communication checklist to solve the problems. If a problem arises during the construction process that was not previously considered, whether discovered by a frontline worker, project manager, or contractor, the person who discovers it will not make the next decision on their own, no matter how experienced they are, but will use a communication checklist to let a professional team collaborate and communicate. For example, they might write on the communication checklist, "On such and such a date, we invite a certain expert to discuss a particular issue," arranging potential problems in advance with the relevant experts and personnel, and together they formulate decisions. There was once a very dangerous accident in the construction industry that occurred because they did not use a communication checklist to establish a communication mechanism. The Citibank building in Manhattan, standing at 270 meters tall, had a very complex construction process. At that time, the construction unit felt that using welding as a technique was too costly. If they changed to bolt connections, the cost could be significantly reduced, so they unilaterally switched to bolt connections without notifying the structural engineer. A year after the building was completed, a student studying the building's structure discovered that the building's load-bearing strength was insufficient. In the event of a major hurricane, the building could collapse. In that region, such a hurricane that could topple a skyscraper occurs at least once every 55 years. After this issue was discovered, and with a hurricane approaching that summer, what could be done? The entire team of experts focused their efforts and came up with a solution. They secretly conducted emergency construction after everyone in the building had left work, rewelding 5-centimeter thick steel plates onto more than 200 crucial bolts. When the hurricane arrived, the building was saved, and it still stands today. However, this incident provides a significant lesson for us. To avoid errors of ineptitude in such uncertain and extremely complex situations, it is essential to use two solutions. One is to use a verification checklist to ensure that all fundamental and important tasks across disciplines and departments are completed. The other is to use a communication checklist to arrange regular and irregular communication work in advance, ensuring that problems and hidden dangers can be discovered and resolved in time. This is not to say that using a communication checklist can solve all problems, but rather that many errors of ineptitude occur because we often fail to arrange timely communication amidst our busyness. This method may seem simple, but in work and life we often encounter such problems. For example, a task might be completed, but the cooperating department doesn't know about it and is still waiting idle, with some people extremely busy while others have nothing to do. Problems like these cannot be solved by relying solely on a verification checklist. A communication checklist is essential for internal coordination. These are examples of how using execution checklists, verification checklists, and communication checklists together can solve simple, complex, and uncertain extremely complex problems in work and life. Part 3. Making it work. You might think all this sounds pretty straightforward, just follow the checklist and communicate according to it, but in practice it's not that easy. In fact, we often encounter various types of checklists in our lives, such as a company's employee handbook, which is a checklist specifying what can and cannot be done. But how many people truly follow it strictly? Sometimes even our own checklists, which might be used a couple of times, end up not being sustained. Why do checklists seem simple but are difficult to use in practice? This leads us to the third topic we need to discuss: principles that must be followed to create an effective checklist. To make a checklist truly effective, the author discusses many techniques and methods. I have summarized 3 very important principles. First, the design must be simple, efficient, and measurable. Second, there must be clear checkpoints in the execution. Third, it must be continuously updated. Let's look at the first principle. Checklist design should be simple, efficient, and measurable. Simple means that the checklist does not need to cover everything, nor should it list all kinds of precautions and operational guidelines in great detail. Instead, it should identify the key content that needs to remind us. Efficient means that the checklist should be result-oriented, emphasizing the effect of the checklist. Making the checklist simple and efficient is the most critical and core part of the entire checklist system. What does measurable mean? It means that the checklist should be specific, operable, and its effects should be observable and thus improvable. For example, making a pastry in Western cuisine requires precise measurements, such as several grams of salt, oil, and flour, with a specific electronic scale to measure these ingredients. This is a measurable and executable checklist. Because the author is a doctor, the book cites very common examples from hospitals. For example, the infection rate after surgery in children is very high. So how can this infection rate be reduced? There's actually a very effective method. Just administer preventative antibiotics to the child 60 minutes before surgery, and post-surgical infections become very easy to avoid. This method is simple, and even medical students wouldn't think there's anything problematic about it. But why is the post-surgical infection rate in children still so high in reality? It turns out that a doctor's work is very busy, often with many tasks and pressures. For example, just as they are preparing for surgery, suddenly a patient with an asthma attack comes in, and the doctor has to rush to deal with it. Or during surgery preparation, if a medical device suddenly signals a fault with flashing red lights, the doctor must hurry to check it, etc. When doctors are busy dealing with various emergencies, it's very easy for them to forget about administering antibiotics 60 minutes before surgery. Investigations have found that in over 1/3 of surgeries, antibiotics were not administered at the correct time. In some cases, they were administered too early, an hour before surgery. In others, they were administered after the surgery had already been completed, and in some cases, they were completely forgotten. So how can this be improved? Later, hospitals began to specifically remind doctors to pay attention to the timing of the injection before surgery on children. And just by reminding them of this one point, the problem of post-surgical infections in children was greatly reduced. A checklist is never a comprehensive operations manual but a rational choice as a thinking tool, focusing on key content rather than covering everything. Therefore, we must make our checklists concise and efficient. Only by focusing on the most critical issues can we control the highest quality, which is why most densely written checklists do not work effectively. The second principle is that there must be clear checkpoints in the execution. What is a checkpoint? It's a prearranged node or situation during the execution of the checklist when a specific checklist is to be used. For example, if you're driving and suddenly the battery light on the dashboard lights up, you might need to stop the car and consult the car manual to see what to do next. The light on the dashboard indicates a checkpoint. To make the checklist useful, such checkpoints must be set to tell us when to use the checklist. There is a band in the United States called Van Halen, and the band's lead singer is the famous rock musician David Lee Roth. Every time they go out to sign a tour contract, Roth's manager adds a clause to the contract. A bowl of M&M candies must be placed in the backstage makeup room, and no brown M&M candies can appear. If the organizers don't comply, the concert is canceled, and they must fully compensate the band for all expenses. This requirement sounds very unreasonable, a bit like a star throwing a tantrum with such strange regulations, but the manager says this is their litmus test to ensure concert safety. Why? Because a concert involves many complex technical issues, and Van Halen uses more equipment than most bands, so their stage requirements are much higher. Concert staff can make various technical errors, such as sometimes the load capacity of the beams being insufficient, potentially causing the stage to collapse. If the floor's load capacity is not enough, the stage might also collapse. If the stage doors are not built high enough, the scenery cars can't pass through, etc. These issues affect the safety and normal conduct of the concert. If the organizers have not carefully read and executed the M&M candy clause, it's likely that they will also have problems in other aspects of the concert. So whether there is a bowl of qualified M&M candies becomes their checkpoint. There was indeed one time when they found brown M&M candies in the backstage makeup room, triggering a comprehensive quality inspection of the entire stage. Indeed, the organizers had not carefully read the requirements for stage weight, and the prepared stage was simply not capable of supporting the weight of their 5 sets of equipment, which could have collapsed. To ensure that the checklist remains effective, on the one hand, the checklist must be made simple, efficient, and measurable, and on the other hand, such checkpoints must be set. Just like the alarms on the dashboard, like the M&M candies during concert preparation, or like actively set quality checkpoints in work, These clear checkpoints tell us when to use the corresponding checklist to avoid risks. How do we set checkpoints? I summarized that we can start from 3 aspects: before, during, and after. Before means setting checkpoints before the task occurs to ensure that the task can proceed smoothly. For example, as I mentioned earlier, before going out, I recite phone, keys, wallet, bus card, which is a checkpoint to ensure I don't forget anything before I leave. Because of work requirements, I often travel, and it's very important to bring the right items on a business trip. If I forget something, it can be very troublesome. So before I go on a business trip, I have a specific travel checklist that covers documents, clothing, equipment, tools, materials, etc. So before I leave for a trip, I don't have to think at all. I just check off the items on the checklist. All the checks are marked, and I definitely won't forget to bring the necessary items. For example, discovering at the airport that I didn't bring my ID would definitely not happen to me. The second checkpoint setting is during the execution of the task. The 3rd-day checklist mentioned earlier by the financial investor Cook is used to check whether certain tasks have been accomplished by the 3rd day. I also use a verification checklist during interviews to ensure that I have considered all factors in this task. The 3rd place to set checkpoints is when unexpected situations occur. For example, if the battery fault light comes on while driving, it becomes an unexpected situation checkpoint. When pilots are flying an airplane, if a fault light on the dashboard lights up, a corresponding fault checklist will pop up. The last principle is that the content of the checklist must be continuously updated. To be usable, a checklist must continually conform to actual conditions. It cannot be that the content still used today is outdated. Even the simplest checklist needs continuous improvement. Only by continually improving can we ensure that the checklist always ensures safety, correctness, and stability. This point is very important and everyone can understand it, and it will be noticed in the process of use, so I won't say much more. In conclusion, this is the main content of Checklist Manifesto. Let's review and summarize. First, the purpose of using a checklist is to avoid errors of ineptitude, which refer to those errors that can clearly be avoided. Checklists are effective for 2 reasons. One is that they can outsource the work of memory, which the brain is not good at, thereby freeing up the brain. The second is that checklists are more reliable, ensuring high performance through visualization and mandatory execution. Next, how do checklists prevent errors of ineptitude? By using execution checklists, verification checklists, and communication checklists, they address simple problems, complex problems, and those uncertain extremely complex problems. Finally, creating checklists must follow 3 principles. The first is that the checklist must be concise, efficient, and measurable. The second is that the use of the checklist must have clear checkpoints, using the designated checklist at designated checkpoints. The third is that the content of the checklist must be kept up to date. One more thing to say, the essence of a checklist is not to list attention items and then tick them off, but to change your values. Many people do not like to use the standard procedures of checklists, feeling that it loses flexibility and becomes rigid. But on the contrary, using well-designed checklists will not make you rigid. They will help you save limited mental energy, not let your brain be occupied by complicated inspection items, but instead free it up to deal with more difficult problems. Checklists are not a rigid doctrine but a practical support system. Using checklists actually brings the greatest flexibility. The original book link is attached at the end for further reading. You can also click the share button below the video to share this book with your friends. Congratulations, you've just finished another book.